Photography 1, Lecture 2, The Lens. This image by Gary Winogrand, taken in the 1960s, is of Hollywood Boulevard. And Winogrand's preference was for wide lenses, in this case probably a 24 millimeter. One of the reasons being that he could show a lot of things going on at once. He saw the streets as being these sort of wonderfully chaotic tableaus that were occurring in front of him at all times, and the wide-angle lens made it much easier for him to capture those moments. In this case, there are several moments going on all at once, it would seem. There's a person slumped over in a wheelchair on the left, seemingly in another space altogether. And then on the right, there is a group of people who appear to be waiting for a bus. And then in the middle, you have these three women coming towards the photographer who appear to be kind of floating above the sidewalk, due partly because there appear to be two shafts of light coming from the sun. Obviously, that's an impossibility. This is a reflection as well as the original sun coming in, but the effect is one of setting these women apart, I think quite beautifully. Philip Lorca de Corsia is a photographer who also works in the streets, largely photographing people. His preference, however, is for much longer telephoto lenses. His way of presenting people is to show them in relation to others, but using soft focus, hard focus, selective focus in this case, to set an individual apart from the rest of the people and other objects around them, as in this case. Wide-angle lenses are really very useful. Both wide-angle and telephoto lenses have their uses. It's knowing when to use them and when not to that sets one photographer apart from another. The wide-angle lens allows one to capture a lot of information, usually with great depth of field. But there's a warning that comes with that. The closer objects get to the lens, the larger they become disproportionately to their relationship with other objects in the frame. So anything that's close is going to appear huge. Anything that's a little further away immediately starts to look very small. So you end up with these very strange, kind of distorted relationships between objects. With the telephoto, it does exactly the opposite. It tends to compress space so that objects that are far away, objects that are close, might appear to actually be closer to each other than they actually are. Also, depth of field with telephoto lens is much harder to, or deep depth of field is much harder to accomplish. And that's also one of the attractions of telephoto lens, that you can separate one object from another simply by focusing on the one object if you photograph with the aperture wide open. This gives you an idea of what happens to light and an image. All images are the projection of light, and this gives you an idea of what happens in both the human eye and the camera. And this chart shows the relative width of acceptance of lenses, the 16 millimeter lens being very wide, showing a great deal. It's particularly useful in photographing architecture if used with appropriate controls. And then going to a much longer telephoto in the center, say around 100, 85 millimeters, let's say, which makes for a very good portrait camera. You lose the distortion that the apparent distortion that you get with a wide-angle lens. On the other hand, the angle of coverage is very narrow, so let's say for photographing an interior, it's not nearly as useful unless all you want to do is create vignettes. August Sander was a German photographer um, at the in the first half of the 20th century, whose objective was to photograph all types of Germans from various classes and societies and professions. And in this case, he's using quite a long lens, which with the aperture wide open, so there's very shallow depth of focus. And so the gentleman he's depicting, who looks like either an undertaker or a banker or an accountant or somebody, um, he's very distinct from his background, which has gone out of focus and has this sort of gray quality to it. Oh, that's very deliberate. This was an image made by Bill Brandt, who was a German um, working and living in England in the middle of the century. And he was doing experiments with people's anatomy and also taking them into the landscape. In this case, he had his model lie down and photographed her ear in the foreground with the rocky beach in between that, or behind that, and then beyond that, the large cliffs and the brooding sky in the background. This is taken with a very wide angle lens. Everything is in focus, and there's also very high contrast to this. That has to do with his preference in printing as much as it does with the actual lighting of the scene at the time. Now, this is another Bill Brandt, but this, in this case, taken with a rather long telephoto lens, which takes a really large number of council houses and compresses them. They appear to be compressed, where this is probably a number of blocks deep. It looks much less so because of this compression that the telephoto lens imposes on the scene. And a photographer like Ansel Adams was always interested in seeing virtually everything in the frame being in focus. And as a result, we have this image of Half Dome in Yosemite, excuse me, taken with the moon behind it. Both are absolutely crisp. And the tonality of the image is also, you'll notice, remarkably wide. You have highlights that are at white, and you have shadows that are at black, and then this remarkable range of tones in between. And actually, to see a print of this is a very much different experience than seeing it digitally on your computer. But since this is what most of us are now able to see, we have to take that. You're going to have to take that for granted. Here's a photograph of Bob Dylan taken by Richard Avedon in the mid 60s. And here he's used a longer lens with the aperture wide open to focus on Dylan and allow the background to blur. Henri Cartier-Bresson, a French photographer, made this image in India just after it gained independence. And his way of working, he was mostly interested as a photojournalist in portraying, excuse me, not only people but also their environments. So it was important to him that the people in the foreground and the mountains in the background all be in focus, which they are. A few years before that, Walker Evans took this photograph of a graveyard in the foreground with this is taken in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, with a factory in the background, and in between them there is some housing. Again, all of it is in focus. This is taken with an 8x10 camera. It's a large view camera, and with a very small aperture that allowed for great depth of field. And this is a photograph of him working, excuse me, in that graveyard. presumably on the day that the previous image, which has now become quite well known, was taken. This is called The Emerging Man. It was taken by Gordon Parks, a great African-American photographer. He worked for Life magazine and, and other magazines. In this case, taken in the early 50s, he was documenting the life of someone who was sort of seen as being on the edges of society. Here, popping his head up out of a manhole in the street. In this case, Parks used a relatively long lens, again, aperture wide open, and focused on the man, and with the foreground, which is rather substantial because the camera was actually, it looks like it was placed actually on the ground, and the background, both of which have gone out of focus in relation to him. This is an image by William Eggleston, who was the first photographer who shot exclusively color photographs to have a one-person show at the Museum of Modern Art, which incidentally changed everything as far as photography, fine art photography was concerned. Color was suddenly acceptable. This was from that show and shows a kid's tricycle with houses behind it. Here he's deliberately used a wide-angle lens and with a small aperture so that the tricycle and the houses in the background are all in focus. And the end result is this trike that looks like it could be many feet high. Either that or it's in front of really tiny houses. Obviously that's just a conceit and a very deliberate one. This image by Keith Carter of one of the Venice canals is showing the use of a more specialized piece of equipment. It's either taken with a lens that allows it to be tilted, which can end up giving you a very narrow band of the image that's actually in focus. You can control it remarkably in a diverse array of ways, so that you only show those objects that you want to see in focus. It can also be a great aid in making depth of field appear even greater if you know what you're doing. This image by Lee Friedlander is from a book called Sticks and Stones, which is about architecture. And here he's violated two of the sort of basic architectural photography tenets. One is that you never tilt the camera when you're facing your subject, as he does here. He's using quite a wide lens. So it looks like, you can see that the verticals are converging. It looks like the house is leaning over backwards. And he's also cut off the top of the roof. Both of these are considered verboten in architectural photography, but Friedlander is not interested in portraying himself as an architectural photographer. He's a photographer who has taken a picture of architecture. And one of his objectives is usually to try breaking rules as he goes along and creating his own, which I think he does admirably well here. Friedlander has been well known for going most places on foot, but in the last couple of decades, he's now in his late 70s, and getting around isn't as easy, so he shoots from whatever vehicle he happens to be driving. And in this case, he's in Las Vegas, and the interior of the car actually becomes part of the landscape for him, and finding ways to break up the landscape with the car in the foreground is one of the objectives. So here we not only have we have Vegas out the windows, but also reflected in the side view mirror. But we also get to see the dashboard and the frame of the roof. This image by Len Gentschel is of a woman in an aquarium, and here he's used a very wide lens, and as a result, we're able to look almost straight up, but also straight ahead, and the uh, the effect in the end is that this woman is completely dwarfed by the environment that surrounds her. Especially nice is having this school of fish swimming over her at the time in this sort of big circle. This is by Andreas Gursky. It's a hotel in Shanghai. And here he's used a very wide lens. And as a result, you see these increasingly or decreasingly, as you move away from the center, you see these decreasing arcs created by the wide angle lens. And the closer you get to the edges, the more distorted these arcs become. Gursky is known for not only manipulating his images a great deal, but even to the point of reversing them so that you're looking at the negative, sometimes blending the negative and the positive, and placing people where he wants them, which he can, all of which he can do rather readily using digital technology, Photoshop. This is another Gursky of an apartment building designed by Le Corbusier, and this is interesting in that it was taken with a fairly a fairly long lens, but on the camera, which was placed in, I think it's 5 separate positions facing the building directly and then stitched together. So it's actually taken from 5 different points of view, with the aggregate result that it looks continuous and as it actually exists.